be seated. I invite you to turn your Bibles to Ecclesiastes chapter 1. In the Roaring 20s, there was a season of time in America that was marked by prosperity and innovation and comfort and excess for many. It seemed like the American dream couldn't be stopped, and there was some of it for everybody. And then on October 29th of 1929, most people woke up that morning thinking that everything was going to be just like it had every other day. The economy was booming, and that was the day of the biggest stock market crash in American history, which led to the Great Depression, which lasted the better part of 10 years. And those who had once lived comfortably without a care in the world now stood in soup lines and struggled to find employment. Families had to send their children to relatives and loved ones, even to strangers, because they weren't able to feed them. They didn't have the resources to be able to make sure their children were cared for well. Homes and possessions were sold for pennies on the dollar to provide for basic needs. Everything was kept and recycled or upcycled. There was not any waste because people could not afford to buy anything. And in our generation, for some of us who are a little bit younger, we can think about September 11th, 2001, where we woke up thinking everything was just fine, and then all of a sudden we for whatever reason, had a TV that was put in front of us, and we saw the news report, and we saw the planes hitting the World Trade Centers, or we saw the World Trade Centers coming down. We saw the charred remains of an airplane in Pennsylvania. We saw the hole in the Pentagon. And where we once felt invincible, we once felt untouchable, now all of that was gone, and we felt vulnerable, and we felt threatened. And so one of the fundamental struggles of human beings is the struggle to find meaning. And this is something that I'm sure you've heard and even contemplated from time to time. It seems to be a theme, and we even hear it in music. So I'm a child of the 80s and 90s, and one of the most iconic songs that I remember playing on the radio was a song called Lightning Crashes by a band called Live. And all it is just it's from the perspective of somebody that is standing in a hospital watching an emergency room and watching people die and babies be born. One moment there's a person that dies, and the next moment there's a baby born. And it just seems kind of like meaningless, monotonous, like there's just this cycle of life that we can't overcome. And it's this never-ending cycle of life and death, whereas other songs try to ascribe meaning to life through relationships or possessions or success or perceptions of others. And all of this, I think, is a reflection of humanity's struggles in general with this issue. We're all trying to make sense of this life and this world and all the chaos and pain and joy and sorrow and elation we experience. And that's why things like 9/11 or the stock market crash tend to sort of rock our world, because we're going one direction and all of a sudden it shifts the other direction and we're caught off guard. Well, the book of Ecclesiastes tackles this issue head on. So I just want to, this is interactive, okay? There's no shame. But raise your hand if you have read Ecclesiastes. Okay. Put your hands down. Now, for those of you that have read Ecclesiastes, raise your hand if you read Ecclesiastes and were left wondering, what in the world do I do with this book? Like, what is this? This is the most depressing thing I've ever read in my life. Right? Let me read you the first or the second verse. Vanity, vanities, or vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Right? That's like, what do you do with that? This book is all about addressing the things that we experience and observe and deal with on a regular basis, living in this world, but don't really want to think about and try to ignore or move beyond. And so it can be a hard book. And so what I'm going to ask as we go through this book and as we go through each week, just stick with me, okay? I promise it'll be worth your while. I promise that this will be worth your while. I can't promise that what's said. But just stick with me, okay? Like this book is not like, it's not like a super happy, sappy song. It's more of a meditation on the realities of life and giving advice on how to deal with those in a way that is healthy and prosperous. So With that said, this is part of the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, and there's a lot of disagreement on who the teacher is. I don't think it matters. Could be Solomon, could be a later descendant of David. What's important to understand, though, is that the teacher, whoever he is a character. So there's a narrator, and then there's the teacher. And the narrator starts by introducing the teacher, and then the teacher, as the character, takes over, and the main thrust or the main bulk of the book is this teacher giving wise sayings and wisdom and meditating on what it is to live in this world. And all I could hear in my head was a Creed song, like, what's this life for? Just over and over again as I was preparing this. And then at the end, the narrator comes back and says, and sort of sums it up and wraps everything up for us. And so today, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. And the first thing we see in the second verse, which I just read to you, is a summary of the entire book. And it's summed up in this word haval. It's a Hebrew word, and that's what the word that's translated as vanity in the ESV, or you might have an NIV where it's meaningless. That is the Hebrew word haval. And this second verse serves as a summary for the entire book. And he uses the same phrase again at the end of the book. So it's sort of the bookends of Ecclesiastes. And he uses this word haval, and the word means vapor or smoke. It's a key word in the book. It's used 38 times. Of all the times it's used in the Old Testament, over half of them are in Ecclesiastes. This is a big word for this book. And as the book progresses, we have this word explained to us in various different ways, because right now as we read verse 2, he just says it and leaves it there hanging. And you're kind of like, what does that even mean? Like, okay, vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What do I do with that? What does that mean? Well, the rest of the book is an exposition on what that means. And so as we go through, that's going to be a theme that's going to come. But for right now, he just kind of leaves it hanging there. He just sort of puts it out there, and then he'll explain as he goes. And as he progresses through, we find that it serves as a sort of metaphor for how life is fleeting and it's a paradox. I heard one person describe it this way. It appears solid, like smoke, and then you try to grab it, and there's nothing there. And then while it might seem to hover for a moment, it disappears. It blows away. And that leads to a sense of meaninglessness and futility. So let me illustrate this a couple of ways. Vacation. There's a lot of excitement leading up to it. You're building up, you're planning. You have this idea in your head of how everything's going to go. You've got it planned out. You've got all of your points where you're going to stop along the way lined up. You've got a map with arrows or with drawings. You've got your reservations in hand printed out because you don't trust that you'll have cell signal service. And you've got your directions and everything. And you pile in, and there's a sense of excitement and elation as you get in the car with your family and you start driving. And it seems like things couldn't get better. And then all of a sudden, things seem to start falling apart. Kid's schedule is off. They're screaming in the back seat. The awning of the camper that you're pulling behind you turns into a massive sail as you drive down I-29. I don't know. It's maybe personal experience. Your vehicle has trouble, and you have to stay in essentially a shanty town trying to figure it out to get it repaired. Maybe also personal experience. When we went on our honeymoon, we had this great plan. We got married. We were going to go to Yellowstone on our way to my first duty station as an officer in the Army at Fort Lewis, Washington. We made it as far as Guernsey, Wyoming. Well, actually, we made it a little bit farther than Guernsey, Wyoming. And thankfully, there was a large hill coming out of Guernsey, Wyoming, so that we were able to, using the momentum of the car, turn it around and coast into Guernsey, Wyoming with no vehicle working. And we spent our honeymoon at the Wagon Wheel Inn along the river of Guernsey, Wyoming, waiting for parts to arrive in this guy was like the only guy that did mechanical work within like a 40-mile radius. And that's where we spent our honeymoon. We still to this day have not gone to Yellowstone National Park. I'm afraid to. Every time we head that direction, things get bad. So maybe God's just telling me, like, you're going to fall in the sulfur and die. I'm going to keep you from there. I don't know. But that's the sense that we get. And we can all relate to that, right? We can all relate to what it's like to go on vacation or have something like that. And you're excited, and then things just start going downhill. Or what about getting married? There's all this joy and excitement. I just did a wedding for a young couple, and we also incidentally happened to take the kids to these matinees throughout the summer where they did the old Disney movies at the theater, and one of them was Bambi, and there's this phrase in Bambi called twitterpated, where spring comes and boys start to notice girls and girls start to notice boys, and they become twitterpated. And all I saw when I was doing the marriage for these two young people was a twitterpated couple that couldn't stop looking in one another's eyes and smiling. And I know what they were thinking because we've all been there if we're married. Like, this is going to be the most amazing thing ever. We are going to do this so much different than our parents did. We are never going to have struggles. We are always going to love each other no matter what. And it's going to be wonderful. Except if you've been married for any amount of time, you start to realize that you married a sinner, and that things that were once cute become annoyances, that the things that you overlook become points of tension and conflict, that marriage is actually one of those things where we expect something and we walk into it with this excitement and anticipation only to be let down. Go a different direction. Maybe you've experienced some significant health issue and things looked grim, and then you undergo surgery or there's some sort of treatment and it's successful and you start to feel healthy. You feel like you got a new lease on life. And then how long does that last? Until you get a call that says that the lab results came back and that it was cancerous. Right? So we can all experience this. We all have experienced this. And so we've all experienced the sense of vapor or smoke where you try to grasp something and it just slips through your fingers. But the meaning of this word is much richer and more expansive, though. And that's why the NIV translates it as meaningless. It's tied to vapor. But when you think about the fact that nothing in this life is lasting, and everything in this life that we hope in is elusive, it leads to the sense of meaninglessness, as if, like, what's the point? Can you ever really accomplish anything? Can you ever really get to where you want to be? Can you ever really be satisfied? It's like worthlessness. Again, he doesn't really clarify here. He's just mentioning it, and then he lets it sit, and then we're going to have a conversation throughout this book as we go, and he'll clarify. And I think we'll find that the context within which he has this in mind, or when we consider the context with which he has this in mind, we find that he's actually right. Right? We'll get there. We'll build to that. But, and that's not to say that this life is meaningless, or that life is meaningless, or that there's no value to life or value to this world or anything like that. But it's meaningless if we consider this temporal world as ultimate. That's kind of what he's getting at. Perhaps a synonym might be absurd. It's just kind of absurd to live life that way. And the point is that all of our experiences, and by the way, the Bible is a very experiential book. The Bible takes common shared experiences and then gives us a grid through which we can understand them and interpret them and make sense of them. And so all of these experiences that we have in life prove that temporal things are like a vapor. They seem solid, then they disappear. We go from elation at a promotion to frustration with our new responsibilities. Joy gives way to sorrow. Contentment gives way to anxiety. Peace gives way to conflict. And many people run through life chasing the next thing that they think will fulfill them, only to find that it doesn't. So I had a conversation with a husband once who's struggling in his marriage, and he's like, my wife and I decided that the best thing that we can do is have another baby that will fix things. It's going to compound them. They cry. So we tend to do this. We go to like the next thing that we think is going to satisfy us, and the next thing that thinks we're going to satisfy us, and the next thing that thinks is going to satisfy, or that we think is going to satisfy us. And really, if you take in your mind and put this into like a picture that we can all grasp, it's as if there's a campfire and a crisp breeze is blowing, and somebody throws some leaves on a campfire, and that makes it smoke up. And the smoke is kind of blowing laterally away from the campfire, and you're just running after it, trying to grab at all of this smoke and trying to put it in your pocket. And that's what many people do when it comes to life. They're just running from thing to thing, trying to grab, coming up empty. And we're kind of like morons as human beings, and so it takes us a long time to learn our lessons sometimes. And so we just keep doing it, expecting a different result. And it's kind of the definition of insanity, right? Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So humanity is insane because we just keep doing this over and over and over and over again. And we can all relate to this in one way or another. We all know what it is to chase mist. We all know what it is to try to stand on clouds. We all know what it is to try to capture smoke. It's impossible and it's frustrating. And that's the point that he's making. We live in a world that is fallen and marred by sin. And the far-reaching impact of sin on this creation is such that the tentacles of its effects reach deep into every sphere of our lives. I just said a minute ago that doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results, is the definition of insanity. Sin causes insanity. Sin causes us to behave in insane ways. And everything in our creation has been marred by sin. And so we experience in various ways the effects of this as we live in this life. So think of this for a moment, even just in the context of the fall in Genesis chapter 3. When sin came into the world, shame came with it. There was no shame before the fall. In fact, it says in Genesis chapter 2 that right before the fall, that the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. And then in the very next chapter, after sin enters the world, what happens? They look down, they recognize they're naked, they try to cover themselves with fig leaves, they hear God coming, they hide themselves. God says, Adam, where are you? And he says, we're over here hiding. Why are you hiding from me? Well, because I was naked and I hid myself. God says, who told you you were naked? Like sin entering the world caused an awareness of our vulnerability and exposure, which in turn caused us to try to hide that and cover that. And so then in, for example, Isaiah chapter 47, verse 3, God tells Israel that God will expose the nakedness of Babylon and their shame will be seen. So shame didn't exist before the fall. We were exposed, we were vulnerable with nothing to hide, nothing to feel bad about, no guilt, no shame. Sin enters the world, and all of a sudden we're trying to cover ourselves up, we're trying to hide ourselves, we're trying to hide our shame. Listen, this is like a theology of clothing right now. The reason that you wear clothing is because you're covering up the shame of living as a broken person in a fallen world. And the redemption of the gospel is pictured in marriage such that a husband and a wife should be able to stand in front of one another naked and unashamed because they see one another and there's nothing that can come in between them because God has joined them together. Right? Never thought clothes had a theology. This also has implications for modesty and why modesty matters, but we'll get to that some other time. The point is that shame came into the world because of sin. And then right after that, in Genesis 3, we see that work becomes hard. So think about it. Adam working in the garden, it wasn't really work. It wasn't toil and labor. It wasn't hard. I mean, we can't even comprehend that because none of us have lived in a world that didn't require work, that didn't require effort, that didn't require exertion, that didn't end in exhaustion. But God says that by the sweat of the brow, you will get food. You're going to have to work now. And guess what? There's going to be thorns and thistles that come up that's going to impede your work. You're going to have to till and dig down into hard soil to break it up and expose areas where, to expose the soil so that it can take the seed. And it's going to be hard. Whereas humanity could just pick their food before and it was everywhere, now they have to contend with bugs and thistles and thorns and drought. So we see that sin entering the world was more than just an individual impact. It impacted all of creation. And then, if you continue, you see that marriage becomes hard. The structure for marriage that God created and ordained would become difficult, and there would be desires that went against God's design for the husband and the wife that would cause contention and discord. So relationships are now impacted too. The most intimate and close relationship between humans that God has given would become work and would become hard, and there would be strife and opposition. Then, continues on, childbirth becomes painful. Now, again, we can't imagine that, but apparently, in God's original design before the fall, with humanity in perfect fellowship with him and in perfect obedience to him, God had created this world as such a good and amazing and wonderful place that not only was food provided and there was no shame or guilt or anything like that, but childbirth, I would guess, was probably a joy. And now, as sin enters the world, childbirth becomes painful and hard. And actually, if you think about this, it's hard for us with modern medicine, but childbirth actually takes lives of mothers. There are complications that come out of that. Side note, if you're a young husband and your wife is having a baby for the first time, or you're an experienced husband and you're a noob, never, ever, ever in the delivery room say, "This is because of Eve." Doesn't go well. Not that I've ever done that. But childbirth and the pain of childbirth is a reminder for us of how much sin has impacted our creation and our world and us. Then we see humanity struggle against Satan and his lurings. God says he would put enmity between the serpent and the woman and between his offspring and hers. In other words, those who follow Satan, the prince of this world, would be at odds with those who follow God, the King of Kings. And out of that comes persecution and wars and conflict and oppression. And not only that, but if we continue to read on in the pages of Scripture, we find that the far-reaching impact of sin is expanded upon. We see tyrants, slavery, cheating, lying, raping, murder, self-seeking, sickness, terminal disease, difficulty with pregnancy, abortion, floods, famine, drought, failed crops, broken families, broken marriages, homelessness, addiction, and the list can go on and on and on. And in a very real and practical way, COVID, not only the virus, but the hysteria and the political corruption we see coming with it, is a vivid reminder in our time of the far-reaching impact that sin has had on our world. And so our lives are lived in cycles. We get sick, we get healthy. We enjoy a season of good times in marriage and a season of conflict. We enjoy freedom, and then people attempt to take freedom. We have just rulers and unjust rulers. We have competent rulers and incompetent rulers. We live in comfort, we live in difficulty. Kids are obedient, and then they aren't. We have the right focus, we lose the right focus. And in this fallen world, and in this context that we just walked through, here's the point. It is very, very easy to become disillusioned and discouraged and think that everything is meaningless if our focus is on this world. Because that's what it has to offer you, right? Not a real pretty picture. Yet sin causes insanity, and we keep getting distracted by it over and over and over again. It can be easy to become disheartened with the roller coaster of life lived in a fallen world with its ups and downs. And the rest of this book is a meditation from a wise teacher on this, and he starts with vapor, vapor. Everything is vapor. And what will follow is a surprisingly encouraging flow of thought that is meant to help us not only find meaning, but joy in a broken world like this. So maybe you're sitting here now and you're like, okay, I agree with all that. How can you ever hope to find joy in a world filled with all of this impact from sin? I'm glad you asked, just to give it away. comes from, and the answer that the teacher gives, is turning our attentions and our affections and our pursuits away from the vain and vaporous things of this world that are transient and lacking substance, and turning them to something greater which does not suffer those shortcomings. And that brings us to the second point. So the second point is found in verses 4 through 11. And in verse 3, the teacher begins by posing a question which is really profound. He says, what does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? So as we've seen, sin impacts every aspect of our lives. And now the question is posed, what does a man gain by all the toil which he toils under the sun? In other words, no one can show a net profit for life through hard labor. No one can show a net profit for life through hard labor. And now, over the next 8 verses, he's going to illustrate what he means, and what he lays forth as an image or an illustration of this world as a monotonous prison. So, I asked you to stick with me. There's a third point, okay? We've got to work through this as he presents it. So, in verse 4, generations come and generations go. Think about this. Right now, in this room, we have people born in every decade here at this church from the 1930s on. Now just stop and think about that for a moment. Every decade from the 1930s to present, 2 months ago for I think the most recent, is represented here in this church. Now, at some point in the future, the decade bracket will move from the 30s to the 40s, and then from the 40s to the 50s, and then from the 50s to the 60s, and from the 60s to the 70s, and for those of us that are sitting here, the 70s to the 80s, and then the 80s to the 90s. Oh my goodness, I'm going to die someday. We don't think about that. And for younger people, you might be thinking, well, that's all well and good, I'm young. If Christ does not return, listen to me, if Christ does not return one day, you will find yourself reflecting that statistically, you're more than halfway done with your life. And then you're like, okay, well, I'll suppress that. I'll just move on. I still feel young. I still have the attitude of a young person. Okay. And then, at some point, you're going to note that you attend more funerals than baby showers for your friends. And then, you'll discover that you have become aware that you have a very real likelihood of not waking up tomorrow. And guess what? In all of that, babies are still being born. New generations still moving forward. And then you might realize that at some point in the future, your headstone will be the only thing that remains, and no one will know who you are. For all of the talk of impacting the world, all of the creators, all of the influencers, all of the social media people, they're going to die and nobody's going to remember them at some point in the future. And there is going to be some guy that works at a cemetery that drives past your headstone or walks past your headstone every day and takes care of it and doesn't give a second thought to who you were. Now, not only that, that's a sobering thought, right? That should give us a second of pause. We're born, and then we die. We have one shot to raise our family, and then that shot is gone. We go through our career and are unsanctimoniously forgotten by the institution we gave a good portion of our lives to. And no one can beat this. You can't beat nature. Your life is a blip in history, and nothing can change that. In verses 5 through 7, he points out how nature follows a routine. The sun rises and sets every day. The word is hastens. The sun rises, the sun goes down, and hastens to the place where it rises. In other words, the idea is the sun is rushing in its monotonous cycle of rising and setting as you age. And days seem to get shorter and blow past you faster. It's like the sun is running faster and faster to steal your time. So we've all heard the phrase, not enough hours in the day. We know we have a set amount of time every day, and it never seems to be enough to accomplish what we want to accomplish. It's like we're racing against the sun. We see it in how the wind blows in verse 6. It's just blowing around in a big circle, in a big cycle. You can't control it. You can't harness it. You can't predict it. It just keeps flowing in an endless cycle. Then the sense of accomplishing nothing is heightened by rivers running into oceans and never filling them in the next verse. And that's the idea of like, if you had a cup and you were trying to fill the cup and you placed it under the faucet and it kept going and going and going, but the cup never filled. That's kind of the picture that the author is trying to give. Rivers are continuously flowing into the ocean and the ocean never fills up. It's just, what is this? It's meaningless. It's just this cycle of monotony. It's a picture of futility. In verse 8, it leads us to a general lack of satisfaction. Notice what he says in verse 8. He says, all things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. Life is weary and meaningless, and therefore no one can say anything significant or meaningful about it. No one can explain it or influence it or control it. Not only that, but the vanity of this world does not satisfy. Think of John D. Rockefeller when he was asked how much is enough money, and his answer was a little bit more. There's this insatiable need to have more, and when we have more, it never satisfies, so we want more, and then we think, if I had this, I'd be happy. If I had this, I'd be happy. If I had this, I'd be happy, and it just keeps, the goalposts keep moving. No amount of hearing and learning can meet our needs. You can have all the degrees in the world and still find more things that you are clueless about than what you know. Isn't that frustrating? Science can't prove some things, and so people set out to try to prove them, and they can't, and that becomes frustration. So they try to learn more, and it still can't prove it. And then for the things that they can prove, when they prove it, they find that they have more questions than answers. It's like you can never arrive at the sense of, okay, I understand this now. I know this now. All of our human resources and faculties leave us staring at a blank wall. And then in verse 9 through 11, he says that what has been and what will be, and what has been done and what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. Is there things of which it is said, see, this is new? It has been already in ages before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of latter things yet to be among those who come after. In other words, we're stuck in the cycle of rediscovering things already discovered. Nothing is new. When I hear about, like, especially with church stuff, when I hear about new things, I'm getting really nervous. Because there's really nothing new. The question is it faithful or unfaithful? And we all are like living embodiments of reinventing the wheel. Every new generation thinks they have come up with something amazing and utterly unique. And all they're really doing is just rehashing or updating something that's already been done. We invented the car. Ooh, guess what? It's just a little bit of a faster way to get from point A to point B. We've been doing that since creation. And in the process, it creates new problems and presents new issues, right? Whereas before you were just worried about breaking your leg or falling into a pit or something like that, or your horse being sick or lame. Now you've got this entire mechanical beast underneath you that now has computer chips, and there's just tons of things to go wrong with it. And so is it really reliable? Is it something new? No, it's just a new form of getting from point A to point B. New techniques might develop and adapt in agriculture, but in the end, it's all just planting and selling. It's the same thing that's been done for ages. The cycle of nature and life that was mentioned before is exactly the same for us as it has been for every person who has ever lived. There's a few senses that emerge. First, the sense that the universe is indifferent to us. As we read this, it just gives us a sense that the universe is indifferent to us. Creation is indifferent to us. It was here before we came. It'll be here after we leave. We're a blip, and there's a permanence to it that we can't impact or change. The second sense that we get is that creation, like us, is actually trapped in this cycle of monotonous and meaningless motion. It's just doing the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. You ever felt like, moms in particular, you ever felt like you were just doing the same thing over and over and over again every single day with your kids? Wake up, feed them breakfast. You get into this cycle. We all experience this. Creation is forever moving, but never accomplishing anything. And then third, we get this sense of loneliness and futility from hoping in this material world and anything it has to offer. Now, having gone through that, I want to take you back to verse 3, and point out the most important phrase in that sentence. And that is the phrase, under the sun. What does a man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? In other words, if we were to go forward to the New Testament, Jesus might say it like this: for what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Gains the whole world, everything under the sun, but forfeits his soul, something eternal, something transcendent, something that isn't tied to this here and now temporal existence. See, the teacher in Ecclesiastes is really pointing out the futility of trying to place our hope and accomplish our satisfaction and enjoyment in a temporal existence without anything that transcends the temporal. There are things that are not under the sun. These things matter exponentially more than anything that is under the sun because they transcend the sun. In other words, you can, with what Jesus says and with what the teacher in Ecclesiastes is saying, we get our first hint that there is more than just under the sun. And I think that's the point he's trying to make. Like, there's much more than just here and now. And we need to really recognize that and live in light of that. So in Jesus' estimation, if you work hard, if you achieve all of your goals, if you become the CEO of a successful company, you have loads of money, and you have tons of investments, you can buy whatever you want, if you are elevated to a place of political power, and yet, in all of this, your aim is such that your focus is only on the vapor of temporal things and eternal things are not cared for, you are a fool and your life is meaningless. And in the final analysis, you lose. Big time. All of your gain is loss. Isn't that what Paul says? And I think you know where I'm going, but I'm not going there. I'm going to Romans chapter 8. In Romans chapter 8, Paul says that the creation is groaning. Why? Because it was subjected to futility by him who created it. In other words, all of creation is groaning with this anxiety and this pain from the monotonous, meaningless cycle of life because God subjected it to that because of sin. And not only that, we ourselves groan inwardly because of the groaning that we live in. The mind that is set in the flesh is hostile to God. The mind that is set in the spirit is life and peace. That brings us to the final point. We need a new hope. And yes, that is a Star Wars reference. We need a new hope. What the author of Ecclesiastes and what the teacher in Ecclesiastes is saying and pointing us to is not a denial of the gospel. It is rather a call to us, reminding us of our need for the gospel. Without the gospel, nothing makes sense. Without the gospel, we fall into this category of vanity, vanity. Everything is vanity. Without the gospel, we lain in toil with no net gain. Without the gospel, nothing makes sense and everything is futile. Without the gospel, we grasp at the vapor in our lives rather than grasping on Christ where there is substance. Without the gospel, we see chaos that makes no sense and, quote, bad things happen to good people. See, with the gospel, we understand that no one is good. There was only one good person, and that was Jesus. And he was the only one to which bad things happened that were undeserved. And the rest of us, in our fallen and broken state as sinners, who are not inherently good in and of ourselves, are impacted by our whole world that is fallen and broken because of sin and subjected to futility. And it is only through Christ that we are delivered from the condemnation of sin that makes life so hard. Without the gospel, we can only hope in this world and what it has to offer. And the author of Ecclesiastes is pointing us to the fact that it really doesn't offer you anything that great. But with the gospel, our hope is not in this world. Our hope transcends this world. Without the gospel, we look at the world and become depressed and see it as meaningless. With the gospel, we see God displaying his glory in saving sinners out of the brokenness of this world. And there is meaning and hope and purpose because we have been rescued from this futile world and have been brought out of futility into hope and meaning. And therefore, we can look at the futility of the world for what it is without hoping in it. See, that's what he's trying to get us to. He's trying to get us to sever the cords of hoping in this life and in this world and in the temporal existence that we live in right now. And the answer is not to try to ignore the mess that sin has caused or try to bury your head in the sand. Because I've got news for you. The Bible is not particularly encouraging about the condition of the world because of sin. In fact, it paints a really bleak picture. And we would do well to agree with it and reflect upon it. Because that bad news is designed to point you away from this world and to wean you from the dependence on this world and reorient you and fix your hope on the good news that Christ came to overcome the world. And therefore, a fruitful, thriving, happy life doesn't come from ignoring the realities that sin has caused upon our world. It comes from acknowledging that and seeing that as an avenue to point us back to our need and the one who satisfies our greatest need, namely Christ. See, Christ offers an alternative to the bondage and meaninglessness and despair that naturally comes from the impact and effect of sin. He deals with it head on. And when we see this rightly, we can follow Paul in saying, I count everything as loss for the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord. For his sake, I count everything as loss and consider it as dung. So when he thought of all of his past accomplishments, when he thought of all of his achievements, when he thought of everything else in all of creation, it was all horse dew when compared to the worth and value of Christ. You've seen that, right? Like you can maybe see something that's valuable, that seems valuable at least, and then you place it against something that's really valuable. And you begin to see all of the flaws and all of the insufficiencies in what you once thought was valuable because you have a new focus. For Paul, it was following Christ. That was where the value was. That was the aim of his life, being in fellowship with Christ. That alone is where meaning and purpose are found because he came to do something new. There's nothing new under the sun. And Christ does something new. What does he do? He gave us a new covenant. He gives us a new birth. He brings us into a new family. He creates in us new hearts. He grants new affections. He provides new satisfactions. He brings us to a new Father. He loves us with a new love. He provides for us with a new stability. He puts within us a new spirit. He provides for us new righteousness. He offers new hope. He promises a new heaven and a new earth and a new existence with him in that new heaven and new earth without the same old guilt and shame and sin that we've always dealt with. He makes all things new. And everything else is passing away and fading away. And when we see that and believe that and pursue that and live in light of that, we become free from the slavery to the folly and futility and vapor of this life. So, where are your hopes set in this world? Where in your life are you pursuing vanity? Where are you chasing smoke and trying to catch it and stick it in your pocket? The call of this text is to turn from the temporal to the transcendent, from the passing to the permanent, from the smoke to the substantive and solid rock of Christ. That's the only way to be free from the monotonous slavery of this world and the unending discouragement and frustration of being let down by this world. Let's pray.